Hey there, all to new friends, welcome back. Whether you're a card making novice or a crafty veteran, using minimal supplies is a great way to expand your paper crafting technical library. Let's take a look at 3 ways to make high contrast black and white holiday cards to jumpstart your stash. Now, depending on your crafty needs, Altenew supplies 4 different types of black ink. Here I have Altenew Jet Black Mixed Media ink, Obsidian Pigment ink, Jet Black Dye ink, and the black ink I will be focusing on is Permanent Black ink. I have the blog post that goes into further detail of the 4 different classes of black ink found at the Altenew store, as well as the other Altenew items I used in this video. So like I said, I will solely be focusing on the Permanent Black Crisp ink. If you are getting a start on your holiday cards, I can suggest 3 modern and unique cards using just 1 color, which is going to be that Permanent Black ink. Now, if you have the others, that's okay. You can definitely use those types of black ink. To the left, I have Build-A-Flower Lelia. This is the October 2021 Build-A-Flower. And then another floral set that I thought complemented the illustration in Build-A-Flower Lelia, and that's the sparkled 6x8 stamp set. And I have the stamp set and the dies underneath. So only using Permanent Black Crisp ink, I stamped the outline images to both Sparkle and Build-A-Flower Lelia, and also 2 of the solid leaf images from Build-A-Flower Lelia. In order to get this high contrast look for both of these flowers, I'm going to neglect most of the layers in the flower portion of these stamps, but ensure that I get the most coverage in the leaves. If you've ever seen black and white photos of flower bouquets, you'll notice that usually the flower portion is really bright and vibrant, and then it's the leaves that usually get pushed back and muted out in a darker color. So that's what I'm going to focus on this high contrast flower bouquet. In my stamp positioning tool, I've taken the most solid layer for the 3 leaf images in Sparkled Stamp Set, and I'm going to use the Permanent Black Crisp ink to stamp and layer this image. So the overall result I'm going to get are these beautifully dark leaves with these high contrast highlights. The next layer I'm going to ink up is this most detail layer. I've aligned the most detail layer in Sparkled Stamp Set, and I'm going to stamp this in Permanent Black ink as well. The last layer I'm going to stamp from the Sparkled Stamp Set is the most detail layer for the center of the sparkled flower. I'll set this panel aside and work on the Build-A-Flower Lelia panel. The Lelia flower is going to work just a little bit differently. I want there to be a little bit of definition and contrast within the flower, so I'm going to darken the lips on this orchid flower. So I've stamped the A7. This is the B3 layer, the other half of the B3 layer, and then finally the last portion of the leaves, the B4 layer. I will use the coordinating dies to both Sparkled and Build-A-Flower Lelia to cut out these images that I just stamped. I have all of my flowers and foliage die cut, so now comes the fun part for arranging my flowers. I'll make a few modifications to the die cuts. Sometimes I like a little bit more control when it comes to arranging my florals. After manipulating the die cuts a little bit, I've settled on an arrangement like this. The best way I find to highlight the flowers is to surround them with a little bit of darkness so that you still get that high contrast look. So I have areas of darkness to really push forward and highlight my foreground flowers here. You can maintain the high contrast look by putting your flower arrangement on top of white cardstock for your card base. Or if that's too stark for you, another option is to overlay this onto a solid panel of colored cardstock. So I have a red cardstock here just for a different look and just to give you additional ideas on how to use your flower arrangement. But for me, I'm going to still use the white cardstock base as I find that it suits my personal style more. But before I glue down my flower arrangement, I'm going to add some splatter to my background. Now, if you don't have the Jet's black ink spray, you can still use your Permanent Black Crisp ink pad to add some splatters to your background. The way I like to do this is to take an acrylic block, dispense some of the ink onto your ink pad, add a few drops of water to suspend the ink, and then use a water brush or a watercolor brush to add your splatters. While this dries back, I'll work on my sentiment. In the Build-A-Flower Lelia stamp set, there is a greetings sentiment stamp at the top, and I like this for a more non-traditional sentiment feel for holiday cards, especially since this is the focus of this video. So I'm going to create a little sentiment strip. I found mounted my foreground flowers on top of my foliage, and to hide just this little bit of the stem that remains on Build-A-Flower Lelia, I've added a little bit of foam tape to the back of my greetings sentiment stamp strip, and I'm just going to hide it, just as easy as that. And that finishes my first non-traditional floral black and white high contrast holiday card. And again, all of this was possible with Altenews Permanent Black Crisp ink. For my second perfect pairing, I'm going to take a look at a technique that's been done time and time again with embossing folders. This is another one from October 2021. This is the Layered Snowflakes 3D embossing folder. And what I'm going to do with this embossing folder is make my background first. With a panel of white cardstock, I'm going to pick the orientation that I want my background to be in. So I've got my panel of 5.5 by 4.25 cardstock. And I'm looking through the embossing folder to see what impression I'm going to get for my background. And I think I like this where I have two corners of snowflakes on my white cardstock panel. So I'm going to run this through my die cutting machine as directed for embossing folders. And you'll see the beautiful dimension that I get on my white cardstock panel. Before I remove this from my embossing folder, I'm going to focus on the debossed side of my embossing folder. So that's the side with the text that indicates that this is from Altenews and it's the Layered Snowflakes 3D embossing folder. I'm going to grab my Permanent Black Crisp ink and apply ink to this side of the embossing folder. And once I have enough ink that I think will cover my panel here, I'll run this through my die cutting machine again. And the ink will transfer over to the debossed side of this folder. I want a more solid impression, so I'm going to do this again. Again, I haven't removed my embossed panel from this side of my embossing folder. And let's see what I got now. So yeah, that's a much better and darker impression on my cardstock. So I'm going to carefully lift this. And I have texture and I have this beautiful dark background for whatever foreground element I want now. So I'm going to set this aside to dry and I'll focus on the focal element to my card. For my focal element, I'll use the older Modern Fox stamp and die set. This is a 4x6 stamp set. Stamping the most solid layer in permanent black ink first. Then I'll finish the fox's face with that stamp layer. I went ahead and just finished all the layers for the fox image. Then I'm going to use the coordinating die to die cut the image. I also die cut the tree image from some scrap white panel I have in my drawer. And then I'm going to stamp the branch image on top of this. And of course I'm using permanent black ink to stamp this branch image. So I have all my elements to my card front that I want for my high contrast black and white scene. I also made a sentiment banner using one of the sentiments. But before I glue anything down, I am going to add a little bit of white splatter to my background here. I love pure white ink spray. I find that it's a very soft white splatter. And I'm applying it the same way I applied the permanent black ink to my background on the previous card. So I'm using a watercolor brush just to add a little bit of white splatter to my background and just to help enhance the snowy effect of my scene. Once my snowflake panel is dry, I've added it to a folded note card base. Then I will begin assembling my scene. So I've already applied Altenews foam tape to the back of all of my die cut elements. And once I've added everything to my card front, that finishes my second high contrast black and white card using just permanent black ink with a little bit of textural help from the Layered Snowflakes embossing folder. For my last perfect pairing, I'm working with Perfect Poinsettia's 3D embossing folder. And just like the previous card, I'm going to do some inked impressions into my cardstock panel. I'm starting with a smaller panel of white cardstock. This is cut to 3 3/4 by 5 inches. And again, I'm looking through my embossing folder, looking for the impression that I want on my cardstock. I'm happy with this orientation with my main flower in the top right corner. So I'm going to run this through my die cutting machine. And now that I have my impression locked into place, I'm going to work on the deboss side. That's the side again with the font, and add ink to this side. You'll see I'll get a very different kind of impression in comparison to the previous card that has a lot of deboss space. This one just has a little bit of detail, and you can sort of see the preview that's happening already. Before I put my background panel away, I'll use my ink pad and do some direct-to-paper techniques. I'm going to add a very grungy edge and vintage edge to my cardstock by running my ink pad along the edge of my cardstock. Now I'll set this aside and I'll work on my foreground elements. New for October 2021 is the Lovely Ornaments Stamp and Die Bundle. I like this stamp set because it's a different take on the traditional ornamental baubles that you see during Christmas. On my white cardstock, I'm going to add a subtle white line on the inside of the steel die that cuts out the bauble. So I have a slight circle outline on my cardstock now. And I'm going to use my outline to align the swirly motif. And then I'll align it again on the bottom half of the circle. The opening between the two halves of the ornament is the perfect width for the sentiment strips within Lovely Ornaments stamp set. So I'm going to align that and space it between the two halves. And that's just a subtle take on my sentiment strip. Before I put the panel away, I'll do a negative impression of this image down in this corner here. So to do that, I'm going to place the solid image somewhere on my cardstock here. I'll do it there. Then on an acrylic block, I'll mount the swirly motif. You'll get better impressions if your ink pad is nice and saturated. So there is a refill for permanent black dye ink from Altenew. So first, I'm going to apply a very heavy and saturated coat. One last thing before I ink up my solid image here is I have a piece of scrap paper down to the corner here. And I'm going to get a nice saturated layer of this ink onto the solid circle. Now, I'm going to work fairly quickly. Once I have the ink down, I'm going to align and kiss this photopolymer stamp to my solid circle, my inked solid circle. Lift some of that ink and wipe it off on my scrap paper. Then I'll do that again for the bottom half. Lift some of that ink. And then once I have the negative impression, I'll take that to my cardstock. I'll press this down really hard, and you get sort of this nice shadowy appearance to your main positive image. Now I'm ready to die cut my two ornaments. Instead of using black cardstock for the toppers, I'm just going to use the same panel of cardstock because I don't need a whole bunch, and I'm just going to rub my ink pad directly on my cardstock just so I don't have to get another piece of paper. I'll use the circle die that I was using earlier to cut out my ornaments. I'll glue down my bauble tops to my ornaments, and then I'll start completing my ornamental scene on my note card base. So in my crafty stash, I've had some old baker's twine in black and white for a while, so I add a little bows to my ornaments. And then I also have some embroidery floss too, and I just taped a little strip to this top corner here so that it can drape and hang over the front of my embossed panel. So I'll start assembling my card. On my folded note card front, I'll foam mount my embossed panel to the front, and I'll just glue this down in an off-center kind of fashion, just like that. And then I'll pull the strings that'll suspend my ornaments and just add a little bit of washi tape just to hold them down. And then using foam tape again, I will raise the ornaments on top of my card front, covering the washi tape that I have underneath. I actually want this in the foreground, so I'm just going to pull this up and over. To finish this card, I'll apply just a few of the essential black and white enamel dots, just the black ones, around my focal area. And once I've done that, I think that finishes this final perfect pairing for another high contrast, non-traditional holiday card. And in this card, I focused on this stamp kissing technique to get another interesting layer to my card. My series encourages you to shop your existing Altenew stash and rekindle their love with newer releases. Perfect Pairings with JC airs on the Altenew channel every second and fourth Sunday of the month. Please make sure you like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for tuning in to this Perfect Pairing episode with me, and I'll see you in the next one.
Hello there! Are you still looking for project ideas and card making inspirations? Well, if you are, look no further. We have tons here at the Altenew YouTube channel. You can also subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any videos that we do upload. To help keep your creative juices flowing, we have a couple more videos that you can watch here too. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you again really, really soon. Bye-bye.